Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm In Jang Cho. Christmas has passed without any indication of military action or rhetoric from North Korea. As Washington remains watchful over Pyongyang's possible provocations, today we discuss which new way North Korea will likely take in the new year.
We'll find out what the surprise is, and we'll deal with it very successfully. Let's see what happens.
In the studio with me today, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, former special envoy for the six-party talks. Ambassador DeTrani also served as the director of National Counter-Proliferation Center. Also joining me, Dr. Adam Mount, senior fellow at the Federation of American Scientists. Dr. Mount co-directed the FAS International Study Group on North Korea Policy, a group of 14 experts from 5 countries. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador, North Korea had warned of a Christmas gift to the United States. Why do you think it ended up not delivering it to the United States?
Well, one, I think that's a good sign. Hopefully the gift is not having a gift that people thought would be an ICBM launch or a nuclear test. I can't answer your question, but I'm pleased to at least sense that Kim Jong-un is thinking twice about passing ultimatums, issuing ultimatums to the United States that if we don't change our calculus by the end of the year, there'll be a Christmas gift. That's not how you do business. He's met with our president 3 times. We've been talking to him for 25 plus years. This is a time now to sit down and work the issues and come up with an implementation to the, if you will, the June 2018 joint statement that came out of President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un.
Well, so far we have been given the gift of a quiet holiday, and many of us appreciate that. That's not to say that there won't be more launches, tests before the end of the year. The regime signaled through several surrogates, several officials, that they were planning an end-of-the-year test. That's still entirely plausible. That could still occur. It remains a serious risk. That having been said, it's also possible that the chairman decides to back away from this ultimatum and it expires without much of a ripple in the water. Obviously, there will be ongoing efforts to try to work through the fallout. Unfortunately, I think the likelihood is still that the regime was so consistent, invested so much time, attention, credibility in trying to signal that they're returning to complete missile tests with longer range missiles than they have all year, that they're unlikely to back away fully. I think we're still headed down a slope where talks are effectively over and tensions are rising.
Mm-hmm. So the 2 important tests at Seohae satellite launching sites and the recent new constructions in the missile-related factory, are these prelude to North Korea's more provocations?
Unfortunately, I think so. All throughout the year, North Korea has been engaged in actually a very clear program of action, which has been to steadily escalate pressure on Donald Trump and the White House, trying to force a concession in negotiations, a breakthrough in talks. So it started early in the year with the New Year's speech where he set an end-of-the-year deadline. They displayed a new ballistic missile submarine design. There were sort of unspecified tactical missile tests, and then more short-range missile launches this year than ever before in the past. And I think the likelihood is that they continue to do so until they collapse talks entirely or until they get an answer that they want out of the president, which seems unfortunately pretty unlikely.
And Ambassador, important political events are coming up for North Korea. The Workers' Party Central Committee meeting and the chairman's New Year's speech. What should we look out for in these important political meetings in North Korea?
Well, I think with the New Year's speech, as we saw in 2018, when Kim Jong-un said that he's walking away from Yongjin and just focusing on economic development and because he said at that time they had a nuclear deterrent, not focusing on nuclear development issues. I think there's a possibility he would say Pyongyang is back. We will continue to work on our nuclear capabilities. We will continue to move with economic development. And the fact on the basically looking at the nuclear issue, I think the comment may be that he's not gotten the response from the United States that he expected, that he feels that the U.S. continues to have a hostile policy despite his good relationship with President Donald Trump. I think that would probably be the most negative of a New Year's speech, saying we're going back to economic development and nuclear development at the same time. We'll do both until we get an agreement with the United States. Personally, I would hope that during this Congress, the Workers' Party Congress that's coming up, the plenum that's coming up in a few weeks, there would be a little more of an impetus towards resolution of the issues. Right now, that doesn't seem likely. It seems that there's a bit of a hard line, or more than a bit of a hard line.
So, U.S. media reported, citing a source that is familiar with North Korean leadership's current mindset, said that actually the Christmas gift is not military provocation, but the revival of hardline anti-U.S. policy. Right. What is your take?
I think they could say that. I think it would be very counterproductive to say it, to be very honest. I think he's playing to his own audience when he says something like that, because he's certainly not endearing himself not only to the United States, but not to China and not to Russia, because we're all looking at that, if you will, the June 2018 statement from Singapore, where we talk about complete denuclearization, in addition to transformation of a relationship, peace on the peninsula, et cetera. But to go back and say, forget about everything that's transpired, I think that would be very unfortunate and also kind of risky in the long run.
Dr. Mount, what is your take? Do you think North Korea's new way is closing the door to diplomacy?
Unfortunately, I think talks are effectively over and have been for several months now. We're not meeting regularly. There's very little talk of another high-level summit. And even if there were, there's not ongoing preparation trying to advance that summit. Unfortunately, I think negotiations are effectively over. It's possible to restart them. But with respect to this Christmas gift language, North Korea has used the words, the language of gift giving previously, specifically to refer to ICBM tests. It's happened at least twice in the past. I've never sort of heard them talk about giving the United States or Donald Trump a gift in any other terms. I think they were being pretty clear about what they had in mind. It's possible they could adjust, but I think they've been relatively clear about what they intend to do.
So, Ambassador, if North Korea launches more provocations and come up with more hardline policy, the first fallback for the United States would be to strengthen sanctions on North Korea.
Absolutely.
But this sanctions and diplomacy, these two tools, isn't this what the previous 4 presidents have used already on North Korea?
That's correct. I mean, there's no question about it.
Is it still useful?
Well, sanctions are useful. Sanctions are biting. There's no question that North Korea is being affected by sanctions. I think that's why North Korea, during the Hanoi summit, came in and said they want the sanctions lifted, because they are biting. The fact is, that's to be negotiated. I think our lead representative, Steve Biegun, has indicated flexibility on that issue. As we see some progress on denuclearization, we could look at sanctions and possibly lifting those sanctions that touch humanitarian issues. So yes, sanctions, but also joint military exercises with the Republic of Korea. I think when we go back to 2017, it was indeed those exercises got the attention of Kim Jong-un. I think we would not want to see, but there's a likelihood we would see a resumption of these intensified joint military exercises, possibly to include the introduction of strategic assets. And that's not where we want to be. We don't want to be going back to 2017.
I think the real risk here is that this president and this administration don't really have a middle way between fire and fury and actively excusing and covering for North Korea's missile tests. There has to be a middle road here, because the challenge has changed. Like it or not, North Korea has nuclear weapons. So the challenge we're faced with now is, how do we manage and shape the transformation of North Korea, working closely with our allies over the long run? Because there's not going to be an immaculate deal that eliminates all their nuclear weapons in the very near term. We're going to be living with this challenge for a while.
This is election year, and what do you think would be the pressure from the Democrats on the Trump administration regarding the changing the course on the North Korea policy?
That's a great question. And we've just seen a number of senior Democratic legislators send a letter to the administration urging them not to fall back into this fire and fury tactic. I think that's the right way to think about it. I think that's the right message to send. I hope it doesn't fall on deaf ears.
Ambassador, what do you think would be the Republican position on North Korea policy in the new year?
Well, I think the policy would be supporting the president. The president has invested heavily in a relationship with Kim Jong-un in resolving this issue. So I think there would be support for the president. But it would not be acquiescing to threats coming out of Pyongyang, these ultimatums coming out saying we have to change our calculus. I think the pressure would be, let's see if North Korea is prepared to come back to negotiations, which they've not been able to do. I mean, we've only had one working level meeting, and that was, that was in Stockholm, which was very unfortunate, 8.5 hours, and we got nothing from the North Korean side. And they didn't discuss denuclearization. I think we have to keep this in mind. The core issue here is complete verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. There are no nuclear weapons in South Korea, so we're talking about North Korea.
So we're at the end of the year. So looking back the past 18 months since the Singapore summit, what do you think should have been done differently? We're not seeing any big progress so far.
I think what possibly could have been done, certainly on the part of North Korea, was to come back to negotiations. The president meeting even in the DMZ, making it very clear to Kim Jong-un, look, I expect your negotiators to be meeting with my negotiators to work on these issues here. So I'm not going to give you much more face time, much more credibility, unless we have actual working level meetings going on this. So in retrospect, I think we should have nailed down the denuclearization, because we know what we mean by denuclearization. We've had the joint statement September 2005, which speaks clearly to complete verifiable, dismantle all nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities. North Korea knows that, but we need to hear them say that. We need to sort of memorialize that. So I think that was one of the issues we could have done right up, and we could have insisted, I'm not saying, this is all hindsight, we could have insisted that, look, now there needs to be at least 1, 2, 3, 4 working level meetings to accomplish certain goals with some sort of a timeline and a roadmap. I think it was too nebulous as to what the final product would be.
Dr. Mount, so everybody's pointing out that North Korea has been insincere and not coming to the talks, but is there anything America could have done differently?
Yes, I think so. I do think it's right to question whether North Korea ever had an interest in discussing the nuclear issue sincerely. They've repeatedly avoided U.S. negotiators. What could the U.S. have done differently? So many things. We could have unified our strategy with South Korea and made a joint approach to North Korea so that Seoul could have offered better incentives, could have engaged on conventional arms control. We could have supported that process, and it would have given us more leverage on nuclear arms control. As Ambassador DeTrani said, we could have been much, much more clear about when and how these meetings should be held. The president over and over signaled that he was willing to meet personally with Kim Jong-un, that that's where the real meeting was done. So he didn't, until the very end, empower his negotiators to negotiate with the regime. The U.S. administration sent mixed signals all along the way, and it took them months and months to get their feet under them until they really started to sort of think seriously about the proposals that they were making. They started off in a very unrealistic place.
But President Trump did start a diplomacy that nobody else did before, and that set up a big opportunity for possible denuclearization.
Unfortunately, I think the way that the process was managed ensured that we would miss that opportunity. I think it was a real missed opportunity.
That opportunity is still alive, right?
It's still alive.
Yes. And on that note, we'll move on to our next segment.
是三方的共同目标。我们一致认为，对话协商是解决半岛问题唯一有效的。我们呼吁美方尽快拿出落实新加坡共识的实际举措。我们鼓励朝美双方就建立半岛永久和平机制。
Amid a deadlock in nuclear negotiations, leaders of South Korea and Japan traveled to China and met with top Chinese officials. China is increasingly pushing for sanctions relief for North Korea. Now, Dr. Mount, China reasserting itself in this nuclear diplomacy, is this a help or hindrance to America?
I do think that it was remarkable just how vocal the Russians and the Chinese were about pushing for sanctions relief. So far, that's a relatively new posture for them. China has been the perpetual hope and wish of Washington. If only China would sort of help us with the North Korea challenge. Unfortunately, we haven't taken the steps required to really sort of put us on the same page in that regard. There have been innumerable efforts. We've tried year after year after year, and it just hasn't panned out. We can't put all our eggs in the Chinese basket. We can't trust that they will help us with North Korea, unfortunately. And I think we've seen continued problems with sanctions implementation that just prove that to be the case.
So, Ambassador, China and Russia tabled this resolution for sanctions relief for North Korea, and South Korea's presidential office says that they are paying attention to this resolution. So, but the State Department said this is premature for any sanctions relief for North Korea. State Department already said that. So is South Korea moving more towards Chinese position on the sanctions relief issue?
Well, I think South Korea is trying to get some resolution so we can get some momentum, because it's going in a different direction right now. We're looking at the possibility of escalation and going back to additional sanctions and fire and fury. Obviously, this is not where South Korea wants to be. This is not where we want to be. So, yeah, I think they are. But I personally think the Russian-Chinese proposal of sanctions relief at this stage would be the wrong signal to share with Pyongyang at this time. I mean, there could be movement on a discussion of sanctions relief if there's a working level discussion on movement on denuclearization, how we're moving on some of the core issues, and that being the core issue. So I think eventually sanctions relief will be part of the package. We have our president invested in this issue. And I personally think Xi Jinping and President Putin, but certainly Xi Jinping is invested in this issue. So I would think there's a bit of pressure on Kim Jong-un to show a little more flexibility on his part to move forward, at least have some working level negotiations to see if we can get some progress on issues like sanctions relief. But just to sit back and say, I want sanctions relief before I do anything, he's conditioning continued progress with this, with the Singapore joint statement. And I don't think you'd want to sort of acquiesce to that sort of conditioning.
And Dr. Mount, since the nuclear negotiations are in a stalemate, do you think China will play a bigger role in the new year?
I think that's plausible. So if we return to fire and fury, China has historically played a sort of dampening role, trying to discourage both the United States and North Korea from taking actions that could result in conflict or that could lead to further nuclear tests or missile tests that could destabilize the region. China's main interest is in stability. And if things start to shake, you can bet that they'll return to that position.
So at this point, when the talks have reached a deadlock, what constructive role can China play and what America can expect from China?
China has a big role to play. In my view, China continues to be a very major player on this. It's not only sanctions, the implementation of the sanctions. The fact of the matter is over 90% of the trade is with China. 90% of the fuel, the crude oil, the petroleum products comes from China. So basically, China can just cut off the spigot and the economy in North Korea would just cave. Obviously, that's not going to happen. We're not looking for anything that touches destabilization. But China has a lot of leverage. The Peace and Friendship Treaty, which is coming up in 2021 with the DPRK. These are levers that China has. And now that Xi Jinping has a relationship with Kim Jong-un, one would think that China has even greater leverage on Pyongyang than they did in the past.
And Dr. Mount, on final note, so do you think the trade war between America and China that exacerbated China's support or cooperation with America on the North Korea issue?
Yeah, it has certainly been the administration's top priority toward China. It has crowded out virtually every other issue on the agenda. It has hindered our ability to have a far-sighted or more sustainable dialogue with China about North Korea. I think there's an adjustment to be made. If we're engaged in a long-term effort to manage and shape the transformation of North Korea, we should admit that our interest is in stability as well. If we share that overlapping interest with China, there should be more opportunity to coordinate deterrent signals to North Korea so that we're playing that dampening effect, and China is as well, to discourage irresponsible North Korean behavior. That has not been the terms on which we've approached China. And quite frankly, I think that the North Korea issue has, if not slipped fully off the agenda, has certainly been downplayed as they sort of move to trade talks and broader military dialogues and tensions in the region.
Can I just comment on that, Dr. Mount's comment? I totally agree with everything you said. But also the denuclearization issue is important to China. This is not just the US issue or a Republic of Korea issue. This is a China issue because China wants North Korea to denuclearize. So we have common objectives here. So one would think China would use whatever levers they have to get North Korea to commit to complete in addition to ensuring that we give them the security assurances, economic development assistance, ultimately transforming our relationship, a peace treaty, all of the above. You mentioned Wang Yi. When Wang Yi was in Seoul, State Councilor, Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Seoul, he talked about that. He actually mentioned the June 2018 joint statement from President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, adding that security assurances, economic development assistance. So we're on the same page. So one would think China could and would, and I think they are using some of the levers, but there needs to be more from the Chinese side. Hopefully the trade issue doesn't impinge too heavily on this issue. But I agree, I think there is some of that spillover from some of these other issues in regards to US-China relations.
Well, on that note, we'll leave our conversation here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of the Indonesian ambassador to North Korea visiting the Taedonggang beer factory. The ambassador said he wants to make Indonesia a hub for marketing Taedonggang beer in Southeast Asia and also export Indonesian beer to North Korea. Experts caution such beer trade with North Korea may be subject to UN sanctions. Dr. Mount?
Unfortunately, or let's just hope that over the next year, we're not all reaching for a beer when we're looking at North Korea. Let's hope that we
have settled this issue. Yes,
and we're not forced into drinking to try to get through the day.
Ambassador?
Indonesia and North Korea go way back. No, I think having an agreement like this it may be in violation of some sanctions, UN Security Council sanctions that are on the books. It's a bit of a diversion from some of the really complex, threatening issues we're looking at when we're talking about nuclear proliferation. Okay, well, maybe that would be a good way of moderating some of this behavior on the part of North Korea during this Christmas period.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ambassador, Dr. Mount, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.